Hello and welcome to On and On with Angela Tharp. I am Angela Tharp, and on this channel we can just do a little deep dive, or not that deep, like 10-minute dive into something in culture that I really liked engaging with. So I have a culture blog, and once a week I write about something once a month. Sorry, that was like a really strong emphasis on the once. Once a month I talk about one thing I loved encountering in culture. So I did that last week. And wrote about the song Where Is My Husband? No, was it Where Is My Husband? Bugonia. Where Is My Husband was 2 months ago. Last month and last week I wrote about Bugonia. So that's just something that I really liked engaging with. And then I go into a week on Richard Pryor because I'm writing a book on him. And so something that I liked and disliked engaging with, or, I just kind of like analyzed that week, and that's what we're doing now in this video. And then there's a week where I write like a long list of culture recs of sort of like everything I was like watching, listening to, and reading. And I kind of give a little description of each. And then the fourth week, I have a poem that I love. So there's like basically 2 weeks where there's like, these are things that I loved. And 2 weeks where I'm just kind of like thinking through either something to do with Richard Pryor. Some parts I love, I'll just kind of like focus on what I love there. And then something just kind of like a long list of the culture recs for the month or the things I've encountered. So this video is about stir crazy. And before I keep going, let me introduce myself in case you don't know who I am. My name is Angela Tharp. I'm a writer and a teacher and a certified Black weirdo in the sense that I'm very pro-Black and Black culture and Black community. And I'm also just like really into nerd culture and specifically like movies, TV, books, music, and what it means. I tend to think about things through the lens of race. My PhD was sort of like thinking through culture with a Black lens and Black representation lens specifically. Sometimes I talk about that. Sometimes I talk about queerness. Sometimes I'm just like, I love this scene. I love this song. Stuff like that. So we're going to talk about stir crazy. We're going to try to make it snappy because I need to go to the airport. But I wanted to make this before I went because I started making these and I don't know. I really like them. It's kind of like nerdy and weird to be recording myself, but it's also fun. So some quick hits on stir crazy. One of them is, or I guess what this movie is about, is a movie from the 80s. I think came out in 1980 exactly. So it's sort of like during Richard Pryor's prime. And it's a movie where him and Gene Wilder, from Willy Wonka fame, run away together basically. And so they both live in New York and they get fired on the same day from their respective jobs. And then Gene Wilder's like, what if we just like left New York? Actually, I'm tired of being here. I want to go west. Do you want to come with me? And then Richard Pryor's like, I guess. And it's really funny. Part of the reason why I wanted to watch this movie is because I saw an interview that Gene Wilder did with Dick Cavett where he was kind of like talking about the chemistry and the tension between him and Richard Pryor. And it was very like bi-coded. And I was just like, I wrote a whole essay about how it was bi-coded and bisexual coded. And I was very intrigued. And then I write in my blog that like when I saw it, it doesn't really seem like they have chemistry to me. It seems like Gene Wilder is kind of like really into his role. Like he's like playing this sort of like naive white guy that's like getting into trouble. Very similar to Will Ferrell and Elf, which I did love as sort of like an optimistic, energetic character who just kind of like sees the best in everyone to his peril. And then Richard Pryor is playing his counterpart. So he's sort of like a little bit disgruntled, a little bit like, Gene Wilder. And he is kind of talking about, or he kind of just like keeps him from getting in trouble a lot of the time. And so I don't love like a Black buddy trope, which is like, if you think about like the Eddie Murphy movies in the 80s, maybe 90s, and like these movies where it's like, there's like a Black best friend who sort of like keeps the white person out of trouble. Don't love that. But what I do love about this movie is that Richard Pryor had a lot of agency, and there were like moments where he was like they do like everything together in the movie. They like pee in the toilet together, and they like try to put on a single pair of pants, and they like are always like hip to hip, and it's like very queer coded, I think, while they're also trying to like signal that it's not, but in a way that's like, I guess if it was a spectrum of like homophobic 80s movies to like queer, like explicitly queer and inclusive 80s movies, it's like maybe like here where there's like a queer character who plays the main role, and it's a joke at first, which kind of puts on the homophobic side, but then it becomes like he becomes someone who like Yeah, I won't spoil it, even though it's like a 45-year-old movie. He becomes someone who's like one of the main characters, right? And he's sort of taken seriously in that way, and his queerness is like a part of who he is in the movie. And he becomes friends with Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder in the movie. So it's like somewhere, it's somewhere along that spectrum, not all the way for sure. And there are like various discriminations in the movie, but I think it's like pretty inclusive of Black people in a way that's interesting. And a lot of Black buddy films, the Black character is like the only Black character in the whole world of the movie. And in this, there's a lot of characters like that, which I really liked. So Richard Pryor in it is sort of a little bit disgruntled, a little bit like disenchanted by the optimism and naivete of Gene Wilder's character. And but I like that he sort of like is in his own world at times where he says no, or like there's a moment when Gene Wilder's character says, I think I can speak for Harry, who plays Richard Pryor, who Richard Pryor plays. And so there's like this kind of like, he says, I think I can speak for him, instead of just like, oh yeah, we blah, 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 blah. And I think that those little moments of like, he is his own person, or not always apparent. And so in movies like that, so I appreciated that. Yeah. And I thought that Gene Wilder's character, despite it being like, if it's unracialized, which everything is always racialized, but like if it's like just this character who's optimistic and energetic, it was at times really fun. Like basically they like run away together and they end up in a prison, which isn't like a full spoiler. It happens pretty soon in the movie. And he's like it's a comedy. So there's also like the whole notion of like, they're kind of like joking. It's sort of like Orange is the New Black in a way, where it's like, it's interesting that this is the setting and it creates like all these plot things that you couldn't have outside of a prison, but also it doesn't like fully take into account what happens in prisons, which they actually say in this. He says, people see like, it's kind of like a meta moment where he says like, people see movies about prisons and they don't really understand what it's like until like, if you were in a prison, you would know what it was like, which is like kind of funny because they're not actually in a prison. So there's like this kind of meta moment. But yeah, so there is that, which like kind of lurking in the background, which I talk about in my blog, of like, ultimately none of this is funny in terms of like the prison system. But there's this scene where Gene Wilder's character is like put in isolation, and they're trying to like get him to do something, which is interesting ultimately, and kind of like moves the story forward. But he won't do it because he wants to be strategic about how he does it. And so they put him in isolation. And then when they take him out like 3 days later, there's like a beat. And then he says, please, just one more day. I was just getting to know myself, or something like that. Like, and it's like, ultimately, if you juxtapose it upon like beside the reality of what this is actually like, it's not funny. None of it is funny. But I think he plays this character who is sort of like campy in a way that's kind of charming, even as he's sort of like white person fish out of water in this prison. And that's kind of like part of the trope in the plot. So yeah, I don't know. I thought that like for an 80s movie, the way it kind of like talked about and was like in relationship to race was really interesting. I thought it was kind of queer coded in a way that was fun. Like there's a part where Will Ferrell, I'm swapping them. Gene Wilder was like, just picture it, me, you, and some girls, all at the beach, and they kind of like throw in this like heteronormativity just to like make it okay, but it's kind of queer coded in a way that I thought was fun. And all of this to say, like, I think the chemistry of him and Richard Pryor that he talks about, I didn't really see. Like, it felt like Richard Pryor was sort of playing like a absent version of himself kind of when he was in the scenes with Wilder, maybe because Wilder was so high energy, but then when he was other scenes with other characters, it felt like he kind of like became a character too, or like he kind of like became himself more, or was more engaged. And I wondered about that disconnect. There's like Wilder has like the story in his biography about how he was on set with Richard Pryor. I don't know if it was for this movie or for another movie, and they were like people were throwing around a watermelon and it fell on Richard Pryor's feet, and he saw it as like a microaggression basically, and threatened to quit the film. And so there's like these, I don't know, there's like underlying racial signifiers that I think are really interesting and might be a part of why, while he's like playing along and like they're kind of seen as this duo in all these movies, it seemed like he was restrained in the scenes between them, Whereas with other actors, especially like there were a lot of black people in the film, but it wasn't like everybody in the prison was black, everybody who wasn't was white. It was like very mixed and interesting, and like I think a little bit progressive in that way, kind of, though there was still discrimination, racial and gender. I think that, yeah, while it was sort of like progressive in that way, it felt like there was still racial stuff happening, underneath. And I wondered if that caused him to be like disengaged in some points and like in it at other points. So, okay, those are some thoughts. I got to go to the airport. But thank you for listening. I would say, I have like 1 week that's like, this is my culture wreck. I have 1 week that's like, here's everything I've read and watched, listened to, which I'll just give some highlights in the video version of the blog. And then I have 1 week where I read a poem and I'm like, I love this poem. And then I have a week that's just like, here's something that I encountered that Richard Pryor was a part of, because I'm like writing it as a collection that uses him as like a through line to talk about different themes in Black culture. And so it's not always like a hard recommend. It's just like this was interesting because, and I would say that this is interesting because the chemistry that I was like expecting to see, I didn't fully see between them, but I think it was just like an interesting snapshot of the time. And we're seeing it was like propulsive and interesting and wasn't like too problematic, though there were problematic parts. It's a comedy, so I don't know if you like comedies or not, but I would say maybe check it out if you're like if it's a rainy day and you're bored and you're looking for something to do. That's what I would say. Okay, gotta go. Thank you for listening. And next week I'll put on my blog like a list of things I've watched, read, and listened to all month. And then you can kind of just scroll through. And in the video, I'll probably just shout out like 3 of them. And there's a blog post about Stir Crazy too that you can check out as well, where I kind of break down even more what I liked and what I thought was interesting about the movie. Okay, so thank you, and I'll see you next week, and pray that I didn't miss my flight.